Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event today. This is Diagnosis and Documentation of Serious Mental Illness. My name is Zach Stewart, and I'm going to be your producer. And I'm just going to run through a couple of quick housekeeping slides before we get going today. I want to let you know that this event is being recorded, and everyone should be hearing my voice. We are providing audio via your computer speakers today and by phone if you need it. We do encourage you to join via the computer audio if possible, and please just choose one audio source. So if you're hearing my voice through both the phone and the computer, you can hang up your phone. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services or the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We are providing live captioning for this webinar today. You can access that by clicking the link on your screen, or alternatively, you can click the link that's located at the top of the All Questions box. That's going to be available throughout the event. You can click on that at any time. Captions will open in a new window or tab that you can position anywhere you like on your screen, and you can adjust the size, color, and speed of those captions. Your line is going to be muted for today's event, but there are some different ways that you can communicate with us. That first is going to be in the public chat box. You're going to see that to the right of the slides, right underneath my picture there. Comments in the chat box do not reflect the views or policies of the presenters, CMHS, CSAT, SAMHSA, or HHS, and anything you type in that chat box is visible to everybody in the room. We also have that All Questions box that I mentioned. That is going to be located underneath the slides throughout today's event. Please type your tech questions in there as well as your content questions. We'll save your content questions for the Q&A at the end of today's event, and then we will answer your tech questions right in that box. We're going to have a lot of people on today's event, so if you can avoid typing your questions into the public chat, because that will be hard for us to answer in there. So just type them all into that All Questions box. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our moderator today, Sherry Downing, who is the Deputy Director of the Homeless and Housing Resource Network. Sherry, you can take it away.
Thank you, Zach. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited about today's webinar. It is really going to be exceptional. We've got two really good speakers lined up for you today. But first, I would like to introduce Doreen Gross, who is the PATH Program Coordinator in SAMHSA's Division of State and Community Systems Development. Ms. Gross has more than 20 years of experience working with grants and contracts portfolios associated with people who are at risk of or who are already experiencing homelessness, and that includes PATH, treatment for individuals experiencing homelessness, cooperative agreements to benefit homeless individuals, and the services and supportive housing grant programs. Ms. Gross has worked with many of the federal partners to coordinate services, policies, housing, and homelessness-related activities. She served as a contracting officer rep, or a CORE, on the Homeless and Housing Resource Network technical assistance contract, which provides technical assistance and support for a wide range of stakeholders. Ms. Gross holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland. We are delighted to have you here today, Doreen. Welcome.
Thank you, Sherry. And thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to mention the samhsa.gov/coronavirus website, which provides guidance and resources for individuals, providers, communities, and states as we work through this uncertain time. So for today's presentation, we're going to learn about major depression, bipolar illness, anxiety disorders, and schizophrenia. We know that serious mental illness affects as many as 1 in 3 people experiencing homelessness. This percentage is even higher for women and individuals who experience chronic homelessness. So we have two presenters today. The first presenter is going to talk to us about the symptoms of each, as well as the difference between routine symptoms and decompensation. And then the second presenter will provide street-level tips and information for working with people with serious mental illness, including a description of the Kessler-6 screening tool. We also are pleased to explore, we are so pleased to explore this pervasive issue in a comprehensive approach that combines clinical as well as non-clinical perspectives. So on behalf of SAMHSA, we'd like to say thank you all for joining us today, and also for the work that you do in this area. We really appreciate it. And I will now turn it back over to Sherry Downing, who will introduce the presenters.
Thank you, Doreen. Wonderful. So let me introduce you to our presenters. We have Dr. Eileen Triggerboff, RN, PMH, CNS-BC, DNS, and DABFN. And if you knew what all those meant, you're doing really well today, and hats off to you, Dr. Triggerboff, for acquiring all of your credentials. She is amazing. She's a clinical nurse specialist in a private psychotherapy practice in Western New York. She's an expert witness and a national and international speaker and consultant on a whole range of clinical, research, legal, and professional topics. She earned her doctorate in nursing science, or DNS, in psychiatric nursing from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She's board certified in 4 areas: as a clinical nurse specialist in adult psychiatry/mental health, diplomat and fellow in the American College of Forensic Examiners of the American Board of Forensic Nursing, and in hospital and behavioral health program accreditation. She's also on the faculty of SUNY, SUNY at Buffalo School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, and School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. Addressing homelessness is a large part of a mental health professional's skill set, and in the course of her work, Dr. Triggerboff has treated people experiencing homelessness. While conducting research with people who had various major mental health diagnoses, Dr. Triggerboff worked with people of all ages who were homeless. Her community service includes responding to calls from family members and friends who want her to contact their loved ones who are experiencing homelessness. And then we also have Aaron Wagster. He is also amazing and is coming from a direct service perspective, and he is the Supportive Services Resource Manager for ICANN Housing, located in Canton, Ohio. In this role, Aaron supervises the PATH outreach team, which engages those who have serious mental illness or co-occurring disorders and who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And then he and his team connect them with services and housing. Aaron's background in education, job coaching, job development, and high-level customer service has prepared him very well for the challenges of serving people and meeting their needs. Under Aaron's leadership, the PATH outreach team has developed strong community partnerships, broadened accessibility to PATH outreach services, and increased effectiveness in serving his whole county. Aaron was assigned the Resource Manager title after demonstrating a dynamic ability to procure resources and connect them with those in need. Aaron was a recipient of the National Alliance for Mental Health Professional of the Year Award in 2019. He also serves as the chair of the Start Point in Time Street Count Subcommittee and was elected Vice President of the Stark County Homeless Services Collaborative. He also serves on the Stark County Homeless Management Information System Committee, so very well prepared to speak to you today. Very excited to have them both. So here's our agenda. We've already pretty much covered the welcome and introductions. Eileen will give you a great overview of the symptoms of SMI, and then we'll also get a non-clinical view from Aaron about working with people who have SMI. And then questions and answers and closing. As Zach asked, please make sure that you put your questions in the all question box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We hope by the end of this webinar you will be able to understand some of the symptoms of different types of SMI, describe effective ways to build relationships, and you'll be better able to understand the Kessler-6 screening tool. The slide deck is in the download box. If you want a copy of it, you are welcome to download that. And with that, I am handing it over to you, Eileen. I am thrilled to listen to you speak. I'm so impressed with you. So there we go.
All right. Okay, so we're all going to talk about the diagnosis and documentation of serious mental disorders, but mostly I want to focus on the symptoms of major disorders because we all know that the diagnoses can shift and change, and what's really important is that we understand the symptoms, what the person is experiencing from whatever problem they have, whenever they have it. So in general, a mental disorder is extraordinarily common. It's more common than cancer or diabetes or heart disease, and we've been hearing so much about all of those topics in the public press, but we don't hear as much about mental disorders, certainly not in a positive note. So at any given time, so many people are going to be having difficulties with their symptoms. So they might have an exacerbation, or they might be dealing with ongoing symptoms that they have to learn how to cope with. And because we know that 1 out of every 5 families is affected by a severe mental disorder. And I just listed a few of them here: schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar disorder, there's anxiety disorders, there's post-traumatic stress disorder. There are so many different ways that people can have difficulty with how they think and how they feel, that it's something that we need to be aware of, not only with the people that we serve, but also ourselves and our friends and our family. So let's just talk about one of the most common issues. I put this up front because depression is such a compelling existence for people. There are different kinds of depression, but in general, the overarching theme is that about 1 in 20 Americans will get depressed every single year. It doesn't mean that they're depressed all the time, but some people do have a recurrent depression. 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 6 men will have a depressive episode at some point in their lives. And that's not discrimination against women. For years I did think it was, but some very competent research shows that, and many of you may have noticed this, that men are different from women. And so we are much more prone as women to have depressive episodes, and men tend to be more prone towards compulsive disorder and other issues. So just to keep in mind how very common depression is. This is the major criteria for major depression in order to make a formal diagnosis. But just in general, something to keep in mind is that you need to have a series of symptoms every single day for 2 weeks in order to get a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So we will all have a day or two that's tough. We have low days, we have crabby days, we have days when we're not really enjoying life as much as we would normally. That does not mean it's depression. We all have vicissitudes in our moods. But if you have every single day a sad mood or an anxious mood, or you just feel empty, not enjoying things, or you're very irritable and that's just not your personality, it's a change in who you are, and it's every single day for 2 weeks, then we're talking that you need to pay attention to that, because there's probably something going on that we can help with, because depression is very treatable. So the danger to when people are having depressive symptoms and helpless. That's the second bullet there, and it's extremely important to pay attention to that. If someone feels that they have absolutely no hope of changing themselves or their circumstances or the world or their community, they just don't have any power or they don't feel empowered, that is dangerous, because that is one of the preludes to somebody feeling like they then live another day with that kind of hopeless feeling, or they just can't help themselves in any way. So important to pay attention to that symptom. The other symptoms are pretty straightforward. I'm sure you know them very well. Changes in sleeping habits. There's a type of depression where people wake up very early in the morning, about 3:30, 4 o'clock, if they're on a day schedule. And there are also people who will sleep 14, 16 hours a day and wake up exhausted. And these are classic symptoms of two different kinds of depression. Eating habits, most of the time you'll have people who will eat more, but more in the beige range. They're eating more carbohydrate-y foods, cookies, cakes, pies, mashed potatoes, macaroni and cheese, those kind of carbohydrate-laden things. Or there are people, when they get depressed, that they just don't eat at all. They might not eat for 2 or 3 days, and they don't feel hungry, and they just don't have an interest in food. And these are important things to pay attention to for people who have the possibility of being diagnosed with depression. And of course, thoughts of suicide, thoughts of death, or suicide attempts. It doesn't mean that every single person who attempts a suicide wants to die at that moment, or that they have depression. You can have attempts for suicide for a number of different reasons and a number of different major mental health issues, but something to keep in mind certainly with depression. Bipolar illness, when somebody is, the layman's term, manic depressed, their mood is going to go in different directions. With depression, the mood just is depressed, and that depressed mood can be sad, empty, irritable, or anxious. With bipolar illness, the mood can go very high, which we call mania. It can go higher than normal, which is hypomania, and depression. Sometimes people who have bipolar illness can have what we call a mixed episode, where they have a whole lot of energy and they're moving really fast and they're talking really fast and they have a lot of pressure to their speech, and everything they're talking about is very depressed. So they have a very energetic depression, and that mixed episode propels us into a different path for treatment, but something to pay attention to. And bipolar illness usually starts young, like in teenage years. It runs in families. It has a heritable feature to it. You can inherit some aspects of it. I've heard some clinicians say that it skips a generation. Well, that's not really true. It's possible, but it's not something you really need to bank on. So just know that if there is bipolarity in a family system, that somebody else is likely to get it. It doesn't go away on its own. Some people will, if they have a manic episode or a depressed episode, and they just think, I just had this terrible experience, I broke up with my boyfriend, or I got a grant to go to a special program, yay! And so they might define their mania or their depression as a response to a particular event in their lives, and so they just figure it'll go away. It doesn't go away. Bipolar illness will come back over and over again. And medications are extremely important in stabilizing people's moods. But as you'll notice by that 99.9%, that means that 1 out of 1,000 people who have bipolar illness don't take medication. They structure their day and their lives in a very strict way. They wake up at a certain time, they eat at a certain time, they have rest or activity at certain times, and they must stick to the schedule that works for them. If they vary it in some way, they go to a wedding and they come home a little later than they normally would, their mood can be very disrupted and it can send them into an exacerbation. But if you are not able to do, or your body just doesn't respond to that kind of strict schedule, then medication is really what's very helpful. There are different subtypes of bipolar illness. There's type 1, where the person will have mania. They'll have a manic episode and they have depressed episodes. And they don't evenly take turns. Mania, depression, mania, depression. You might have 7 or 8 depressive episodes before you have a manic episode. There's just no way of predicting. But when somebody has mania, they have type 1 bipolar illness. Type 2 is much more difficult to diagnose because the person might be hypomanic. They're just talking a little bit faster. They have some grandiosity, but it's not ridiculous. But they have a lot of depression. They have multiple depressive episodes. And many times people are diagnosed with depression because that's what the clinician sees. But it's really type 2 bipolar. It's just they haven't had an episode of hypomania. And they might not ever with type 2. Usually we find out when an antidepressant doesn't really work very well in stabilizing the person's mood. And under those circumstances, then we might try a mood stabilizer in addition to an antidepressant. And if they respond to the mood stabilizer well, then we know we have a type 2 bipolar. Rapid cycling is when the mood digresses from normal. So we all have a little movement in our mood, like, yay, I got a great parking spot, or oh, I got a ticket. So our mood will go up and down with our experiences. But a manic depressive person, their mood will go way too high for the circumstances and way too low for the circumstances. And if that happens 4 times or more in 1 year, we know that that is a rapid cycle of their mood, and we treat that differently with medication and with therapy. Mania, whether it's from type 1 or hypomania from type 2, is commonly accompanied by psychosis. The psychosis, when the person believes they have an identity that is very famous, or that they're very rich, or that they have special skills, or they're a deity, or they're a governor, or they're a governor who's a deity. So that kind of psychosis will interfere with their behaviors. They're going to be reacting and interacting with people in a way that certainly people are going to find problematic. And there are a number of ways of dealing with that, but that's something to keep in mind. Anybody, any major mental illness can certainly have a psychotic symptom where somebody has an experience that isn't real, but we're going to talk about that more with schizophrenia. So something to keep in mind, that someone might have very strong feelings and a strong belief that something is going on with them that is not real. It's not supported by reality. So that's basically the definition of bipolar illness. And here are the manic symptoms. And the abbreviation is DIG FAST, just as a way of remembering the major symptoms that happen with people who have mania. The D is for distractibility. They're really not able to stay on topic. They'll look around, and it's anything that's in their environment they're going to be distracted by. The I is insomnia, and they're just not sleeping. And they might be up for 3 days in a row, and they are not tired, and they're very busy during those 3 days. They're painting things. They get started on painting something, but they get distracted, and so now that's left to go and dry and get goopy, and they just move around a lot and don't complete it, and they don't get tired, and they really wear themselves down. It's something that needs to be paid attention to when someone is not sleeping for a sustained period of time. The G is for grandiosity. They will believe that something is greater and harder and more potent, and they have more skills than they actually do have. And this can be dangerous. So if you have somebody who is grandiose and they feel like they have perfect balance, they might get up on the railing of a 9th floor balcony and dance. And because they have this perfect balance that they believe about themselves, it's extraordinarily dangerous. And they can fall and hurt themselves or die. And it's all as a result of this inflated view of their skills and their presence in the world. Flight of ideas is what's going on in their head. So they're thinking things very, very quickly, and sometimes they can't even keep up with their own thoughts. They tumble over each other. It's very difficult to track it. Agitation, they're not mellow, calm people. They will have, when they're having a manic episode, they will be very involved in activity. Their speech will be harsh and loud, and the volume will be high, and you can hear the agitation in their voice, and you can see the agitation in their body. It's a behavior that you're going to observe. Their speech is, I think the best description of their speech is it's like a fire hose. It comes out high pressure, high volume, a lot of information, way more information than you're going to be able to track. And that's classic, that kind of speech pattern. And then the T in dig fast is for thoughtlessness, but it's really impulsivity. But dig fussy doesn't make any sense. So they don't think through. Something will occur to them, and they'll impulsively do it. They'll get up on that railing and dance. They'll try to swim across a very rough sea. They will do something that people would think would be very dangerous to do, but because of the grandiosity that might be backing it up, they won't really be able to think of the consequences of their behavior. And it's dangerous when somebody is not able to restrain their impulsivity. So those are the major symptoms of mania. And something to pay attention to before we go into the anxiety group is that when people have bipolar disorder, and I know we're not going to spend a lot of time on treatment, but a lot of people don't like to take mood stabilizers. The mood stabilizers will help somewhat with the depression, not great, but it takes the mania completely off the table. So the person no longer has that wonderful feeling of being the best at something or being respected in a very important and famous way. They won't have that, and that's difficult to live without. And they'll feel dull, they'll feel numb, they'll feel like they can't think very correctly. I've had people who were very creative, writers and sculptors and other artists, and when they're taking their mood stabilizer, they feel like they can't express themselves artistically as they normally would, so they take their medication basis. This is something to be discussed thoroughly with your treatment care provider so that some kind of an agreement can be made so the person feels as comfortable as they can feel. And many times I will not have the full dose of medication that I know would take the mania completely away, and they might have feelings of hypomania, and it's manageable, and they don't do anything dangerous under those circumstances. But those are the kinds of situations that need to be addressed, is how the person really feels about their medication and their quality of life as a result of it. So that's bipolar. Anxiety. It's an interesting part of our lives. We can have a low level of anxiety, and it's more along the lines of, what do I have to do today? How can I get this done? Do I have gas in the car? Do I have a transit card that's fully plumped up? But then there might be something in the environment that's a little bit more challenging, like you're going to have an exam, or you're going to have an evaluation, or somebody in your environment is not acting as they should. And so your awareness of your environment goes up with your anxiety, but it doesn't keep going up as your anxiety goes up. Your anxiety can reach a different level that is interfering with your ability to process the information in your environment. So low to moderate levels of anxiety are motivating. They make you pay attention. Oh, look and see, is it time for me to cross the street? That truck looks like it's a little out of control. I'll just stay here until it passes me. So low to moderate levels of anxiety are really not to be treated. They're to be managed, and the person has to learn how to cope with their anxiety if it's very uncomfortable for them. But we don't need to erase all anxiety, because then you wouldn't do anything. You would just be sitting around staring off into space. You'd be calm, but you wouldn't be getting anything done. But if your anxiety goes to high levels, high enough that it can even approach panic, you're not going to be absorbing a lot of information, and you're not going to be able to really function fully. You're going to have flight, run away from what's making you so anxious, fight, stay and kick it out with somebody, or freeze, where you're just stunned by what's going on and you are basically immobilized by anxiety. And so you need to pay attention to what's going on with the people you're working with about the level of the anxiety. The level can't be so high that you're not able to absorb what you're trying to do, that you're not acknowledging the level of stress and anxiety that they're experiencing. And psychiatric symptoms can certainly create stress and anxiety, and their circumstances are going to double down on that level. So people who have any kind of a psychiatric disorder, they're stigmatized and they're marginalized, and the community doesn't treat them with any level of graciousness as we would hope our civilization would do. And so that's going to increase their stress and their anxiety, which will in turn affect their psychiatric symptoms, which will then increase the stigma and the symptoms that they're experiencing. So all of that needs to be acknowledged when you're dealing with somebody. If they are at too high a level of anxiety, you need to not give them a lot of information. You need to pace it so that they feel as comfortable as possible in the circumstances so they can absorb what you're trying to tell them. There are many anxiety disorders. They're probably one of the most common mental disorders for children and adults in the United States together. So we have a great deal of anxiety, and sometimes that's not acknowledged as it should be. Excessive fear and anxiety related to disturbances need to be addressed. When you have too high level of anxiety, whatever you're trying to do for that individual is probably needing adjustment. There's a significant overlap of other mental disorders and anxiety disorders. For example, if you can imagine somebody who has an auditory hallucination or they have a delusion, and it might frighten them, especially if it's a paranoid delusion. They're frightened or they're angry, and so their anxiety level is going to go up from whatever they're afraid of, and so their psychotic symptom can actually make anxiety symptoms worse. And paying attention to those realities will make whatever you're trying to do with an individual help. If a person has low to moderate anxiety, they're probably going to be able to understand instructions and plans that you have for them, or be more often contributing to their situation. But moderate to higher levels of anxiety, you need to slow down and you need to give them an easier infusion of that information. And if nothing else, just keep that in mind. Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is fairly common. It occurs naturally in 1 in 100 people, and it's been around for at least 2,500 years. We've had descriptions of the symptoms of schizophrenia, although we haven't always called it schizophrenia. It affects all your thoughts and all of your feelings, your emotional feelings as well as your physical feelings. Your body is not going to be the same when you have schizophrenia. There's a chemical imbalance. There's too much of a neurotransmitter, a brain chemical in one part of the brain, and there's too little of that same brain chemical in another part of the brain. So it makes it very difficult to stabilize somebody if you just give them a medication that increases that particular neurotransmitter or decreases that particular neurotransmitter. Medication is very important for people who have schizophrenia. It helps them manage some of the psychotic symptoms. They might not disappear from the medication, but it helps the person cope better. But that is not the only treatment mode. When people have schizophrenia, they need many other services besides medication. I mean, you can't just give somebody a pill and say, here you go. You have the treatment all encapsulated, as it were. That's not the way it works with schizophrenia. The two categories of major symptoms in schizophrenia are positive symptoms. The positive symptoms are you have it, you're sick. Psychosis is a very common positive symptom. That's another word for positive symptoms is psychosis. And psychosis is either hallucinations, which happen in the 5 senses, hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, or touching something that's not there. But that's what your brain is telling you. Then there's delusions, which is also a psychotic symptom. Delusions are thoughts, things that you believe, and those thoughts cannot be supported by reality. And the most common delusion is a paranoid delusion, where the person feels persecuted, that somebody is taking something they value, or they're trying to hurt them in some way, the most common. And the third positive symptom, it's not, I don't have my bullets completely okay there, but just to give me a little leeway here. The third psychotic symptom is disorganization. It's not a delusion, and it's not a hallucination. But you're so disorganized, you can't get a sentence together, you can't think clearly. It's not just messy desk. If it was, a whole lot of us would be in trouble. But it's being disorganized to the extent that you are not able to communicate well and to function properly. So those are all the positive symptoms. If you have those, you're sick. Then there are what we call the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. The negative symptoms are, we call them the 4 A's because they all have an A in them. It's a way to remember. A, volition. We put an A in front of something, it means it's not happening. Volition is the voluntary activity. A, volition means you don't have it. Anhedonia. Hedonia is hedonist. They enjoy everything. Anhedonia, not enjoy anything. Flattened affect, no matter what's going on, you're going to respond the same way. You know, I won the lottery. Normally we'd be like, yeah, I won the lottery. I won the lottery. My mother is very sick. I have to go to program. All that flattened way of communicating. And then alogia. Logia is using language to describe your experience. Alogia means you don't have any language or you have a poverty of speech. So just quickly, how to tell the difference between a routine symptom and a decompensation is if you hear a sound that's not there, that's something you can cope with, something you can manage. Unless that sound is telling you to do something, that's a problem, and that's when decompensation can be labeled. Believing something is not real, okay, we can have delusional thoughts, that's a symptom, but acting on that belief in a dangerous manner needs to be addressed. Major changes might propel somebody to hospitalization. Interactions when people's emotions are in poor control, regardless of their diagnosis, it's their symptoms that can disrupt their emotions. If they have a sudden onset of distress or anxiety, irritability or anger, or they're just doing things without considering what may happen down the road, what are the consequences, and expressing their emotions inhumanely. You can have whatever emotion you want, but you have to be humane about how you communicate it. And everybody needs to know how to do that, whether you have a major mental health diagnosis or not. Talking about your problems in therapy or with somebody who's providing services doesn't change. You have to change something about what's going on. And think about alternative behaviors when you're dealing with people who are having a lot of symptoms. And be mindful about your own impact about what's going on. You have to take good care of yourself. So breathing is good. And when you're intervening with somebody who is very ill, what you say is something along the lines of, I noticed you're having a problem, I noticed you're upset, I noticed you're angry, I noticed you're crying. What can I do? How can I help with that? Your nonverbal is to make sure that you look calm and that you look and sound capable. And if you don't know to look calm, get in front of a mirror and practice, because you might not be calm. You go shake it out in the kitchen later, but you need to look like you are of some use to that individual who's having a very difficult time. So that is the general features of what I wanted to cover. And thank you for listening for all of that. And now I'm going to hand it over to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I appreciate that. I actually learned a few things myself. So I want to take a little change of pace here and present things from a non-clinical approach. You know, my experiences are going to be from direct service of those that we serve, specifically via, you know, our PATH program in Stark County, and has taught me a lot. But everything that I'm saying is really takes its root from what Eileen has said. So I'm going to not belabor anything that she said, but kind of look at what does it look like from a non-clinical perspective. So, and I will say it's not incumbent on those working in a non-clinical capacity to make a diagnosis. That's not what we're meant to do. That is a clinical responsibility. But I believe it is important to be educated so as to identify those patterns of serious mental disorders. It also allows us to best serve a participant and can inform decision-making and interaction, things of that nature. So I want to pose a question here, and please feel free to put your feedback in the public chat. So how do you identify that someone has a mental disorder if you are non-clinical? I'm interested in sampling your thoughts on this. Don't be shy. Okay, I'm seeing symptoms. Okay. Symptoms like Eileen shared. Asking about a previous diagnosis, mood, observing behavior, body language, behaviors, okay, outburst, the actions that are being exhibited. Excellent. These are all the things that you're saying. Those are excellent things, and it brings me to this. All right. And there we go. A little refresh here. So what you're saying is true. So exactly what you guys were saying is true. So we're observing the indications, those symptoms that Eileen had spoken about. And specifically, the actions, the speech, the body language, those are important. And allowing you to understand what might be happening with someone. So, and no one's expecting, in a non-clinical capacity, you know, although it would be really probably helpful to to memorize the DSM-5, right? No one's asking you to do that. But paying attention to facial expressions, to tone, to rate of speech, to body language or movement or non-movement, these are things that help us understand that what might be going on with someone. So let's take a look at some of the same things, the indications or signs and symptoms of mental disorder. We talked about anxiety already. My experience with participants who have severe anxiety, there usually is an expression of dread and the expectation for, or the anticipation of the worst possible outcome. There's an underlying fear there, and it usually stems from a past trauma. So in my experience, people that I'm communicating with or interacting with, whether it be in our drop-in center, the office, or on the street, there's usually this restlessness in their movement. So they're shifting in their seat, they're fidgeting with their hands, their faces are contorted, or there's a visible distress that's happening there. And that's from that physical standpoint. And audibly, their rate of speech may be frantic or abrupt, and typically it's undergirded with some degree of emotion. So for me, in encountering individuals in this state where I'm observing this type of, these indications, usually I want to create this calming environment, and I do that by my tone of voice, the reassuring tone that's consistent. Changing spaces will help, and also meeting a need. So someone's hungry, someone's thirsty. It's kind of redirecting the energy, and it almost acts as a distraction. But those are some things that we can observe about anxiety. And let's take a look at depression. So we may not be able to observe things like changes in sleep or appetite unless we have this sort of long-term kind of relationship. But I'm someone who has struggled with depression myself. So is my family, and I have friends as well. So I have a little bit of experience. And what I've observed in myself and others is there's this disengagement. And I'm not going to go to the degree of depth that Eileen did, but keeping that in mind, there can be a disengagement. There can be a lack of responsiveness or motivation, even to things like a greeting or a question that's asked. I've had individuals who they just felt so overwhelmed by their feelings that they didn't really have the energy to respond to something, and because it would just take too much. And along with that, you have these thoughts of hopelessness, and sometimes they take the form of these expressions like, what's the point of it, or why should I even try? And those can certainly escalate to more extreme thoughts, such as suicidal thoughts. But these are things that you can pay attention to that may indicate that this is something that someone is experiencing. And also that you have that sort of changes in movement, the agitation, some of the things that Eileen had talked about. So those are, that from my perspective as non-clinical, those are things that I would pay attention to. Let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, this is not something that I encounter a lot, and a lot of people will claim to have it, but it's, even though they've not been diagnosed, and they may well have it. There is a difference between post-traumatic stress syndrome and then post-traumatic stress disorder, which is actually, it's a diagnosed disorder. So I'll share briefly, there was an individual who was waiting for me in our drop-in center, and I tend to have a naturally quiet gait when I walk, and I thought I made myself known, my presence known, but the time that I got up to the person and began speaking, that person was very startled by me, and I remember leaving to get something for the individual, and I would keep startling them, and after I had to apologize, and after a time they apologized to me and said, I'm so sorry, and shared with me a specific traumatic event from their past that was causing that reaction. And so going forward, I was very careful to announce myself or make myself visually seen or audibly heard, so that my presence was announced. I didn't want to cause a re-traumatization, as it were, or exacerbate that person. There's another situation where I had a smaller office at the time, and I invited a participant to come in and speak about their situation privately, just to protect their privacy. And the individual was very reluctant, very hesitant, because there was an association with and the room was even trauma-informed. Like, it was, the color, everything, but it was something about the size that was sort of calling back to a previous experience, and so we conducted our interaction in a different place. And one more example, there was an individual that was looking at a permanent supportive housing unit for their housing, and the place that they were shown, the layout was very similar to something that they had experienced in the past in prison. Not that it looked like that, but it was just the space, the arrangement. And the person had to leave the building because they were feeling heightened as some of those memories were coming back. And needless to say, that individual passed on the unit and looked for acquiring another one. But those are those memories, those experiences can be brought to the forefront with post-traumatic stress disorder. And things that you look for essentially is being aware of how someone is responding to a place and or an interaction. If there's a hesitancy, there probably is a reason for that. If there is some alarm caused by being in a place, there's a reason for that, and we have to pay attention to it. I want to share a little bit about schizophrenia, as I have had many experience with those who have either been diagnosed or displayed those symptoms. And there's a particular individual in the community that I've known for quite some time, even before my time in my current place of employment. And so this individual became connected with me because they needed reconnected to services, and also were in need of housing. And this individual always spoke about this one person that I believe is a real person that had done them dirty, to quote, and would continue to harass and threaten the participant, and essentially was the cause of the loss of SSI, food assistance, and housing. That was the claim. Interestingly enough, this person seemed to, this harassing person seemed to appear at places and be involved in things that really they would have no method of being involved in, or no means to be involved in. I remember driving with the participant from our first connection to community mental health services, and the individual talked about, got very upset and said something, and I asked the individual about it. The participant said to me that, hey, this person said this and just did this, and they're following us right now. And I hadn't heard anything, and I looked around, and there's no one following us. So there was that moment of, that wasn't actually occurring. And that continues even to this day, where whenever something goes wrong, there's this association with that harassing individual. They're the reason why this is happening. And I want to be honest about psychosis here, because I don't know personally if I've actually experienced someone who has displayed psychosis, because schizophrenia and psychosis have these overlapping symptoms. But I'll share this story with you. So there was an individual who I had developed a relationship in our community, and I kind of understood this baseline, the baseline of that individual. And the individual would always come in and ask every day for the same thing, for these specific hygiene products, and had some very disjointed communication and thought processes, but very polite, wonderful individual. And we would always connect, and it was good. But I feel like I had a good understanding of the baseline of that person. Well, one instance, this one particular day, the individual came in and, unbeknownst to me, had called 911 and was very suspicious of everyone except me, and was saying that certain individuals that worked here at our agency were plotting and working to undermine that individual. And so, I reached out to our local crisis, mobile crisis unit, and the officers that had been called, they showed up, and they were CIT trained officers, but the individual wanted to have nothing to do with them and would only speak to me. And I'm looking at this individual. The individual is clearly in a state of duress, and their conversation, their language is, well, it was very much disjointed. There was a lot of things pulled in about what they were doing, that they worked for the CIA at one point and currently, and also could see certain things that were not there, and very distrusting of any person around them, or pulling in current events, things that were happening right there into the conversation and commenting on that, and as well as some religious ideas, and kind of were insisted on some of these ideas. And what I did was, since I was the only one trusted, we had a conversation. I learned that this individual had not eaten, was probably experiencing exhaustion and potential dehydration. So through that little trust relationship, was able to get them the things that they needed, and then they seemed to be better after that, and was able to connect them to their provider. So I can't tell if that was a point of psychosis, but just because it could have been a manifestation of schizophrenia. So, but I knew something was different there. The baseline was different. There was some decomposition for sure. There was even like visually, there was like a little bit of drool coming out of the individual's mouth. Their mouth was kind of half cocked open, and that was not normal. So then how how can you confirm consistency of mental disorder indications? How do we know that this indication, from a non-clinical standpoint, these indications we're looking at, how do we know that they're not one-time events? How do we know that they are consistent? And so I'll open this up quickly to the public chat, just curious on what your thoughts are. How would you confirm that what you're seeing is a consistent thing? Don't be shy. Ooh, I love it already. I'm seeing it. So I'll go ahead and click forward here. Developing a relationship, that's what I'm seeing. Building a relationship is key. It's absolutely the case. That is my experience with most things, is that relationship is key. So the ability to engage and build rapport and also take advantage of opportunities to connect human to human, that is going to allow some insight into patterns of a person's behavior. It allows you to even understand their baseline so that you know who they are, what their situation, when their situation changes. I'll give you an example. That individual that I talked about earlier that I believe was displaying symptoms of schizophrenia, and I don't know the actual diagnosis, I really don't. But I've known that person for years, and we have a really good relationship. And my experience with this individual has allowed me to understand the individual's life, their well-being, and to the average person just looking at this person, they would probably assume that there was maybe substance use involved. But what I know is that the individual is aware that they have a speech impediment and that they had damage to their legs, their feet and their legs some years ago. And so if just the normal outsider, not knowing the nuances of that person's life, would say, oh, this person clearly, the way they communicate, the way they move, that movement, it has to be substance use, but it's not. And so as the relationship with this individual has increased over the years, there is this degree of transparency that we've achieved where the individual will share with me both positive and negative things that maybe they're participating in, and that gives further insight into the needs and also service opportunities for that individual. So, and that is because a direct result of building that rapport, that trust relationship. It's absolutely key. I want to take us in, with all that being said, we have that backdrop of those symptoms, those indications. There's the importance of documenting it, and I want to share briefly some non-clinical forms of documentation, give you some examples. So there is something called the Kessler-6, and Harvard professor Dr. Ronald C. Kessler developed this tool called the K10 and the K6. The K6 is a shortened version of the K10. This is a tool that basically is a series of questions, and it serves as a snapshot of psychological distress. It also can sort of give this indication that there may be severe mental illness present. And so we use it in our intakes. It's in our PATH intake. It's part of other paperwork. And I wanted to share this with you briefly. So this is just a quick part of the Kessler-6. And it's got the following questions, and they reference specifically the past 30 days. So during the past 30 days, how often did you feel nervous, hopeless, restless, or fidgety, so depressed that nothing could cheer you up, that everything was an effort, or that you felt worthless? And you see that there's this rating scale between the 0 to 4, 0 being none of the time, and 4 being all of the time. So once you you go through and ask that person to evaluate that in the last 30 days, then you take that score, which is tallied and totaled, and then here you have this sort of scoring rubric that will give you some indication of where they are. So if you're scoring between the 20 to 24, there is a severe and persistent mental illness. Again, it's an indication. It's not a diagnosis, but it is an indication. There's also reference to that. If you're interested in learning more about that, there's a reference in the deck, if you download the deck, to that specific tool. As working with those experiencing homelessness and also being a housing agency, we work quite a bit in what's called the Homeless Management Information System, which is basically the shared database to include relevant history, observed behavior, life changes, impactful events, and progress of an individual. So it's a way that we automatically are kind of tracking information, and it allows us to, if we need to, go back and say, okay, well, this happened in the individual's life. So it gives us an indication of how we might best serve them. And lastly here, there is what's called the verification of disability. Those of you who may be working in housing or working in a PATH program may understand this a little better, but essentially a VOD, it stands for the verification of disability. It's a HUD document. It's used for housing those with mental and physical disabilities. And typically a licensed health professional is going to use this form to verify or evaluate that a person with those impairments could greatly benefit from housing, and obviously they're that in general. And what this serves as is it supports that a participant has a mental or physical disability, and also it acts as documentation that there was an assessment that was completed. So we keep that because it's important for housing, but it also kind of is that strong indication that someone has that mental health disability. And I would say, just to kind of sum everything up, the most important thing to remember in a non-clinical capacity is this, that we need to pay attention to the indications. We need to be, first of all, need to be educated about the various symptoms. That's important. Not necessarily that we need to be clinicians, but we need to be educated about them. We need to understand the indications, and as it is going to best inform us on how to serve someone, to make decisions for that person, and to interact with them. We need to build relationship with individuals because it grants insight, it allows for transparency and the best service possible. And documentation is important because it can inform us about the history, about the past, and we can even provide some of that information with a release, of course, to clinicians as it might be useful. And so those are the big things about the non-clinical approach to the diagnosis and documentation of severe mental disorder. And I will turn it over to the capable hands of Sherry. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you, Eileen. Those presentations were as good as I had hoped they would be, so excellent. We do have some questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to start this one with you, Eileen, because I think it's more of a clinical question, and then I have one more after this. But could you talk a little bit about borderline personality disorder, Eileen? That is a request from Adrian Verdon Venable. And you might be on mute, my friend.
No, I'm not on mute. Okay, can you hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you. Yep, all perfect.
Yay. Okay, so borderline, before I get cut off again, borderline personality disorder. A personality disorder is where it's not a major mental health issue. It's a personality where they are having extreme feelings, either extreme, everything's wonderful and fabulous, or everything is a catastrophe and a trauma and just the worst experience in their life, and you're horrible, or you're fabulous, or you're just, an angry person they can't talk to, or the only person I can ever talk to. Borderline personality disorders are very difficult to treat. They have to be taught usually through therapy, how to have emotions that are in between those extremes, how to have a continuum where you feel contentment and courage and disappointment and frustration as opposed to fury and ideal experiences. So knowing that that is their emotional pattern, that they go to extremes very easily, can help you to be a little bit less bruised psychologically when you deal with people who are borderline personality disorders. It's not about you. It's about this is how they have managed. This is how they have coped with their experiences, regardless of what their backgrounds entail. Once they have that diagnosis, we can't medicate those things out of there, but we can provide services and therapy so that they can function more competently in their relationships. They're very mercurial. They're very extreme in their responses. So it's tough. It's tough to have a relationship with somebody who's always going to the end of the continuum.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Erin, do you have anything to add, experience with borderline personality disorder?
I actually don't, and here's why I say that. It's possible that I have, but again, without knowing the full diagnosis of maybe, there are individuals that immediately come to mind and I'm like, hey, that probably could fit some of those categories, but again, I don't have access to their diagnosis, so it's possible. So I can't really comment other than look, again, paying attention to behaviors.
Absolutely. And that one can be my understanding is that one can be sort of a difficult one to diagnose, certainly difficult to treat. That was a great question. Thank you. We have another question from Erica Parks, who's saying, can schizophrenia be healed or just treated and maintained?
Well, and healed is a very optimistic term, but it definitely can be treated, and people can go into remission, and people can have low levels of symptoms that they can certainly cope and manage with. So the goal is, I mean, we all have something we walk around with. Somebody has diabetes, somebody has hypertension, somebody has sinus infections. Often, somebody who has schizophrenia needs to learn how to cope. One of the pluses about schizophrenia is that about half of the people who have schizophrenia, I think it's 53%, once they hit middle age, if they did not drink and they did not drug to any problematic level, by the time they're in their 40s or 50s, things start to settle down, and they are much more likely to be stable for long periods of time. Certainly stress would cause an exacerbation of symptoms, but I think healed is probably a little bit too optimistic, but definitely stabilized and calming down and coping with managing their symptoms. And there's lots of people in the public press who have told their stories about how they have coped with their symptoms, and they are incredibly competent and functioning individuals. So there is hope.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Eileen. I'm not sure who to address this question to, so I'm going to start with you, Erin, because this seems like it might be your wheelhouse more. So how does somebody get a copy of a disability verification form?
So typically, I knew that question was going to come, and I appreciate the question being asked. I knew it. There's a couple other I'm sure that will pop up here. But so specifically, the continuum of care, which is sort of like the local entity of HUD, right? There are guidelines that HUD gives for a verification of disability. The local COC usually has they usually put that together. That's my experience. So there's that input, but it's really by HUD guidelines. There are specific questions that are asked. Had we had a little more time, I was going to delve into that a bit more. But I know that there are specific questions that are, I think, across the board that must be answered, and it has to do
Mm-hmm.
with specifically with does this person have a disability, and it's not just physical, it's physical and or mental, mental health wise, that will that's impairing them from living independently. That's the type of question, and it all kind of ties back to will housing benefit this individual's well-being, and the point of the verification of disability is if a person is at such a level that they would need to have that kind of access to that supportive housing. So that's typically when those are issued.
Oh, thank you, Erin. I appreciate that. Very good. I wish we had more time. We still have some questions that need to be answered, but we are really out of time. I didn't even get a chance to ask my final question of Eileen and Erin, so I will just thank them for their wonderful expertise and encourage you to reach out to any one of us if you have further questions. And then